Rebecca Weaver. I love talking to Rebecca. Human resources, friend or foe? I'm an advocate for small business. I have a small business. I started back in the 90s. Oftentimes human resources gets pitted against the employee, because there's a conflict of interest there because it's supposed to be the mouth of the employee, but often is not. It represents the company as well. I open up with that question, how are we going to get the kind of love back in human resources and HR? We have a great discussion about it. She had a TED talk, which brought up, and she had a great quote in it, of course. If you change the condition, you change potential. You need to kind of soak that in for a moment. What a fascinating story, Rebecca. She diagnosed with breast cancer right at the beginning of the pandemic. They make the decision, her husband and her husband's working at a hospital where they diagnosed the very first COVID patient. And they have two small children. So they decide for the husband to move out. She can't be susceptible to the condition. She tells more about that, how she was at certain employment agencies or areas and what happened with the conflict with HR there, how she got in to human resources. She tried to move out, but it pulled her back in. But just a wonderful, wonderful conversation. Again, small businesses is the heart of the economy, certainly in the States, and I would surmise it in the world as well. Thanks for listening. Hi, I'm Joey Pinz. People ask me, how did I lose 130 pounds? The quick answer is always discipline. I started my business, wasn't paying attention to my health, was eating too much, drinking too much sweets. My daughter was born. Next thing I know, I'm pre-diabetic. I have hypertension. I knew something had to change. Discipline. I, like many of you, have faced many challenges in your career, in your family, in your life, in your faith. How did you attack them? How did you approach them? How did you solve them, hopefully? It all had to have some degree of discipline. I'm also asked, how did you found and start a tech business that lasted over 25 years? Discipline. I was committed to it, enjoyed technology, didn't enjoy some aspects of it, but knew it was necessary. Discipline. Our podcast mission, how do we use discipline to better ourselves and society? Join me, please, as I talk to interesting people and discuss how they use discipline in their family and their passion and their careers and how it helped them. Our podcast vision, growth through learning from others. Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. It'll be light and serious. Join us, please. Thank you for consideration. Rebecca Weaver, thank you so much for your time today. I'm very excited to talk to you. How are we going to get the love back in human resources?
Well, that is such a fantastic question to start off with. So, how do we get the love back into HR? I think first and foremost, we've got to think differently about the role of HR. So one of the things that I hear most often, interestingly enough, there's one phrase that keeps coming up over and over again as I talk to people about their experience with HR. And that phrase is, I was burned by HR. Burned. And so having been an HR professional for 20 plus years now, I think one of the biggest challenges is what we think of as the role of HR. So you ask most people, what is HR's role? And they would tell you, HR is there for culture, for the employees, employee advocate. I hear that sometimes too, right? And I think all of those things are well and good. I think they're very well intentioned. I know hundreds of really great HR people. The challenge is when it comes right down to it, our goal in HR, I always coached my teams to let's find the solution that is best for the employee and best for the company, right? And ultimately, most of the time you can find that. Great company culture, good for the company, good for the employee, right? All of these things. However, if there's ever a conflict between what's best for the employee and what's best for the company wins out every time. And it is HR's role to not only support that, but to promote that. And that is HR's number one priority. And that's the problem. And that's why I think so many people have come and they would use the term that they feel that they were burned by HR is because they come looking for that employee advocate, but what they get is a company representative.
Right.
So I think we've got to blow up the function of HR completely. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to protect the organization, right? That, again, in the long run, that's probably best for most employees. However, it is a complete conflict of interest to expect the same, in many cases, the same person. Sometimes it's the same team, but many, many times it's the same person to be responsible for both, for example, investigating misconduct in the workplace, and also be that person who is involved in developing people, promoting people, deciding who's ready for the next level. It's just an inherent conflict of interest.
So how do we resolve that, Rebecca?
So I think a number of different ways. First, I think we've got to, so part of the deal with HR is that the role really has not changed significantly. Like what we expect of HR hasn't changed since HR began over 100 years ago.
Wow.
So, and what we have seen, though, especially over the last couple of years, is we continue to add things on. Let's heap on more things onto the role of HR. And so we've developed this skill set that we refer to as a generalist, right? Which means you know a little bit of a lot of things. And now, since the pandemic, of course, we've also added on top of that chief mask compliance officer and chief, did everybody get their vaccine officer and chief, all of these things, right? And so it's only gotten worse. We continue to heap onto the role of HR. I think what we have to do, and I've long advocated for this, is we have to go back to a more specialized view of HR. And so we have truly different teams, different people responsible, for example, for employee safety. And I mean psychological safety as well as physical safety, right? And so investigations, employee misconduct, all of those things would fall under that category, and have that be a completely separate team from the team who helps you decide who's ready for promotion, or, who's developing, what are their career plans. And that's probably also a completely separate team from your administrative stuff, your benefits, and risk management and keeping up on labor laws and all of that good stuff. So for me, it's really going back to specialized, and not really looking at having it be the same team that's responsible for all those things.
But inherently, HR is an internal, employed by department of the corporation. So it's going to inherently protect the corporation. Now, I know you offer fractional HR. So, I mean, if it was actually external from the company, wouldn't that kind of help as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is why we developed fractional HR. It's why we offer that as a service. So a couple of different things I think that does. So fractional HR, just to explain if people are not familiar with the concept, is where our clients are primarily small businesses and smaller nonprofits who don't have their own in-house HR. And so they come to us and say, we're completely overwhelmed. We need HR support, but we don't have either the budget or the time or resources to actually hire this person in-house. Or maybe we're not ready for it. Maybe our team just isn't large enough for a full-time person. And so what happens is they get paired up with one of our HR consultants. We call them coaches. Means the same thing, but I much prefer the term coach. They get paired up with a dedicated coach, and that person then, though, is a part-time HR person. They get to know the team, they get to know the resources, all the things that are needed. But again, it's a fraction of their time. So part of what that does, number one, is it introduces an independent person, right? Who can help, certainly they can help the organization identify risks. They can help them identify what are things that are going to get you in trouble legally. Of course, that's always number one on the priority list for an organization. But even more than that, they can be a sounding board for employees who know that this is an external person to the organization, inherently does not have the same biases as somebody who would be internal. Their paycheck is not signed by the organization, right? All of these things help to provide a more independent type of support for the employees. And as a result, that independence helps create more trust.
Because it's independent.
Yeah.
It like kind of reduces the liability. Your TED Talk was incredible, Rebecca. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. If you change the condition, you change the potential.
Yeah. Yeah. I gave that TED Talk a number of years ago. It was before I even started my organization.
Yeah.
And it has been this idea, I have long had this kind of love-hate relationship with my chosen profession. It's one of those things that I realized I loved it when people said, "You don't really seem like HR." They would tell me, "You're kind of not the typical HR person." And I really wore that as a badge of honor, which is such a strange thing because I chose this profession. But part of what that is, as I really kind of unpacked that idea, it was just that it felt incomplete. The structures that we have in place for employees feel incomplete. When I really think about it, there's so much that is stacked in favor of the company and still very little that's really there for employees. And it was really that idea, that this kind of nagging feeling that the structure that we have is really incomplete. And so the TED Talk was really about what this concept of potential that we use in a corporate sense, about how much it leaves out. And the idea that we're really leaving out and losing our compassion, our empathy, our humanity, really when we use this very specific term in a corporate sense. And so where you hear that term potential is when there's a whole process that most companies, larger companies, refer to as talent management. That happens a couple times a year, or maybe it's once a year, but it happens on a regular basis. And leaders in HR get together and they discuss, where do we see this person within our organization? Do they have potential? Where's their performance? And a lot of times it shows up on this matrix. And so again, my question with that TED Talk was about, all that's being left out of potential. And I've seen it so many times. So changing the conditions, meaning not every job is the right job for a person. Not every, even the high potential people can get into a role that is not the right fit. Maybe it's not the right time. Maybe there are life circumstances that are getting in the way. There's so many things that get left out of that whole process. So that's ultimately where the idea for the TED Talk came from.
But then you question if potential is not what you achieve, it's not what you're born with, is it a mission? But then you assert that perhaps potential is helping others, and how do you help them find theirs? It's a wonderful kind of thought experiment.
Thank you. Yeah. The idea and it's interesting to see, because again, that was quite a few years ago, and to see how much has happened since then that I think still reinforces that idea. I am in the middle of writing a book right now on post-traumatic growth. And so it's this concept that not a lot of people have heard of, and I had not heard of before the pandemic. I had my own experience where I was diagnosed with breast cancer at the beginning of the pandemic. And my husband happens to be an emergency physician who works at the hospital where they treated the first the first patient in the US with COVID. So it hit us very, very early where we live. And so we essentially ultimately had to make the decision for him to move out to protect myself, our two young children. So I went through chemotherapy during the pandemic with two young girls by myself at home. And that was about 5 months. During the very early days of the pandemic, we knew very little about the virus at the time. It was a
Mm.
terrifying time for all of us, but especially for those of us who were really immunocompromised. And so I learned about this concept of post traumatic growth while I was going through treatment. And, for me, I think part of what was so appealing is this idea that there can be growth after trauma. This is not toxic positivity, though. I want to be so, so clear.
Mm.
This is not the everything happens for a reason, and so
Mm.
therefore it's okay. Or, oh, this experience is here to teach me something. It is not about that at all. But this is about this really traumatic thing happened to all of us. We all collectively experience some version of trauma during the pandemic. We watched millions of people die and even larger numbers. The last figure I saw was 100 million people infected with COVID
Mm.
here in the US. So we watched hundreds of millions of people fall sick. Over 1 million people died. It affected every aspect of our lives. And that was a trauma. I'm not a psychologist, I should say, or a psychiatrist. But I think that was clearly a traumatic event for all of us. And the idea being, we can still grow from this. This happened. This was something that occurred to all of us, and yet we can still grow from this experience. And so that's what the book is about: is telling stories of folks who, like myself, had those types of experiences during the pandemic, and exactly how do we grow from that type of really challenging life circumstance.
Yeah, I remember I heard you talk about this experience, and the decision for him to move out was that you were afraid that he would get infected and infect you, who are really susceptible, and as well as your children.
It almost certainly would have killed me at the time had I been infected with COVID. And at the time, if you'll remember early on, once we started to learn a little bit about the virus, what we knew early on was that the incubation period could be up to 2 weeks. So somebody could be infected. It may not have been quite 2 weeks, but the incubation period was long enough that people were infecting others before they even knew they were infected
Yeah,
themselves. So it was like 4 or 5 days.
it changed. It changed a
It's
couple times.
yes,
Yeah,
yes. But at the time, what we knew was that it was
right.
very highly, highly likely that people could pass it on before they even had symptoms themselves. And so we knew that should he start to experience symptoms of COVID himself, he could have already passed it to me before we even knew. And so we just knew that at the time it was the safest thing for us to do. We were really fortunate to have friends who had a spot in the bottom of their basement where he stayed. It was kind of a mother-in-law unit, if you will, in their
Oh,
home, and they offered it up for him to stay, and he stayed there for the duration. Um, and yeah, when the weather was good, he would sit out on our deck, and my daughters and I would sit inside, and we would talk to him through the screen
wow.
door, always at least 6 feet apart, of course. When the weather was bad, he would do the same in the garage. That is ultimately how we saw him. We did Zoom stories at bedtime, and that was how we engaged for about 5 months.
What a crazy, crazy time.
It was.
Uh, one you mentioned one episode that you had, one incident that you had where you're working at this particular place and you work in these bankers hours, you're late picking up your kids, and the staff is kind of almost mocking you because you're working so much, and there's this definite problem there, and you go to management with it, and they just completely take the other side, and you're pregnant and they lay you off. I mean, it's just this traumatic events that your good work in HR kind of backfires on you.
Yeah. So that was another event pre-pandemic. So I was working for an organization. I was the head of HR. It was a somewhat small organization. And we had a number of employees in hospitality types of roles. And we like to bill ourselves as being very progressive at the time. And we were experimenting with work from anywhere. And this was all, of course, before it was forced upon most organizations with the pandemic. But we said we don't care when or where the work gets done. We just care that it gets done. And what I learned with that experience was that these old habits, I don't even know if habit is the right word, but these old ways of thinking, this I must see you, butts in seats mentality, right? I must see you to know that you are getting work done. Never mind that the majority of the time in the office might be completely wasted, but I must see you to see that you are getting work done. And so the reverse of that is, if I don't see you, you must be screwing off somewhere. You must be doing something that is not related to work at all if I don't see you. And I didn't realize just how deeply ingrained that kind of mentality is. And so I took the organization and our founder at their word when they said, we don't care when or where the work gets done. We just care that it gets done. We want flexible schedules. We want flexible work locations. And so I did that. I would go work from some of our we had multiple properties. I would go work from some of those. I would, leave at a fairly decent hour, 5 p.m. I actually left at the last possible moment that I could leave so that I could still get home to pick up my daughter from daycare. And she was always the last one being picked up, of course. So if you're a parent, you understand just the absolute heart wrench of that, but that was happening every day because I started to get snide comments. And as I was leaving, must be nice working banker's hours, right? Things like that. But what I finally recognized was things did not get bad. That culture didn't turn toxic until I spoke up about the double standard that I saw that existed for women in the organization. And it was decisions we made about who would get preferred shifts. It was questions about different policies and how those were being applied. It was that we couldn't keep female. We had, as I mentioned, hospitality. We had a number of women in leadership roles, but we couldn't keep them in role because the expectations were so out of whack.
Wow.
And our marketing materials were all overtly sexual in nature. And so I finally kind of put all these pieces together, and I sat down with leadership and I said, hey, I'm seeing this as a pattern. And if I'm seeing this as a pattern, like, again, let's go back to my role in HR, right? My job was to protect the company. If I'm seeing this as a pattern, somebody else will eventually as well. And so I felt like it was my duty to sit down with our leadership, our company's leadership, and lay it out for them. And not only did that go absolutely nowhere, I then became the target. It was, I realized later, it took a while to unpack this, but I realized later that in their minds, I had broken this kind of unwritten pact. Again, that HR is always there to protect the organization at all costs. I had broken that by exposing and by talking about some of the things that were going on behind the scenes. And so then it was not too much later when I told the CEO at the time that I was pregnant with our second child, and 8 days later, he told me I was going to be laid off. And he had supposedly been working on a layoff plan and et cetera, et cetera. And so I ultimately ended up resigning from that job because number one, I didn't want anybody to think that I had anything to do with the layoffs that he was planning. And I couldn't stay there anymore. It was not an organization that was within my values. And ultimately, I had to leave.
Yeah, but Rebecca, by quitting, you lost your severance.
I did. And, interestingly enough, that was like the first question the CEO had too. Well, why wouldn't you stick around for severance? And at the time, it was far more important to me to maintain my integrity. Again, I didn't want anybody to think that I had anything to do with a layoff that was at best unethical and at worst potentially illegal. And I just worked too hard for my professional integrity. And now what I would say is I am very, very glad that I didn't stick around for the severance, because I would have had to sign away, my rights to tell my own story. I very definitely would have had a confidentiality agreement, in return for receiving the severance, because that's a very, very typical company practice. And so I wouldn't even be able to talk about it now. And so it was a terrifying time, though, I will say. Very likely at the time, had they offered me any kind of severance on the spot, I probably would have taken it. I was the primary breadwinner for our family at the time. I was pregnant. Again, that's not a great time to be looking for a job. And so I probably would have taken it. But again, life happens, and grateful now to be able to have full control over telling my own story.
What is a problem performer?
Mm-hmm. So I love the term problem performer. This, again, started back with my TED Talk, with the idea that, so again, go back to that conversation about performance and potential and the grid and the talent management process that many big companies use. So one of the labels, one of the boxes or categories that we would put people into was problem performer. And so that was somebody who had both low performance and low potential. So they're not performing well in their current job. And in addition to that, we do not see them having any kind of future movement up within this organization. We don't see them having the capability for promotion. So that person would get labeled a problem performer. And I love the term now because it's one I've completely flipped on its head. I named my podcast Problem Performers because when I think about it, all the most interesting people I know have been labeled problem performer at least once in their life. At least once. Myself included. And so the idea, really the reason I love it is because those are the people who are bucking the trend. They're the ones who are speaking up. They're challenging the status quo. The problem performers are the people that I find the most interesting.
And it means that they're performing well, but they're still.
So in the corporate sense, in the talent management context, what it means is this person's not doing their job well. So they're not performing well in their current job. And also we do not see them having the potential to be promoted. So that's typically what would get you labeled a problem performer in like the corporate talent management sense. In a kind of more colloquial sense, that term is used a lot. And I've coached hundreds probably of leaders over the years. And they will come and say, so-and-so is a problem performer. And usually in that sense, what they mean is it's not working out, or they're challenging me in some way and I don't like that, or, they're not a culture fit. I hear that a lot, right? So in some way that person has fallen short of expectations, whether it's performance or culture. So that's the kind of more informal use of that term.
So the remedy is a PIP program and get them going or let them go, or do they instruct you on that?
I mean, that's usually problem performer is usually, if they're labeled a problem performer in the talent management process, yes, usually it's a performance improvement plan or a PIP, or some type of corrective action or disciplinary action, depends on what your organization calls it. But yeah, that's the kind of accepted going practice for someone who is a problem performer. What I would argue,
yes,
what I think really needs to happen is a conversation with that person. I mean, what I recommend to leaders when they come to me with that, hey, so-and-so is a problem performer, first I want to dig into the leader's perceptions. Like, where is this coming from? You know, what are we really digging into? Are the issues that we've identified, are those actual behavioral issues? So for example, like, are those things we could actually see, we could hear, you know, we could see, actually observe in behavior? Are these assumptions we're making? So for example, so-and-so is lazy. Well, that's an assumption we're making. So-and-so doesn't value our time. That's an assumption we're making. And what I really try to get leaders to think about is, what is the behavior? And when it comes to giving good feedback to people, we really have to focus on the behavior, not the assumption we're making about that behavior. So good coaching sounds much more like, hey, when you came in to the meeting 10 minutes late, we had to restart the agenda to catch you up. And so what that does is it wastes the first 10 minutes. And so, right. So that is much, much more specific and much more focused on behavior and even the impact of that behavior, rather than, you don't value anybody's time. You come to every meeting late, right? That's very, very different. So part of, digging into this problem performer label is separating out that behavior versus the assumption we're making about the behavior. And then it's really checking in with that person. I mean, the first question I'm always really curious about is, how does that person feel that they're doing? How do they feel? What is their sense of how well they're doing in their role? Is there something going on? Is there something leading them to miss the first 10 minutes of the meeting? And do we just need to adjust the meeting start time? Right? There's hundreds and hundreds of possibilities, but it really should be a two-way dialogue to really check in with that person, and give them a safe space to be able to say, like, yeah, I just really feel like this isn't going well, or I don't feel like I can meet the expectations, and here are A, B, and C reasons why. So again, it really does need to be a two-way dialogue to dig into it.
Yeah, to that point, on your Instagram, you have a post where it says you're having a difficult conversation at work, 3 parts: situation, behavior, and impact.
Yeah,
That's
I love
exactly what
that.
you're talking about.
Yep, that's exactly it. I love that formula because, number one, it's simple. Doesn't need to be fancy. Simpler is much better because it's easy to remember, and it really helps solidify. But yeah, it's that formula. It's, what was the situation, right? So give the person some context. What was the behavior? Again, that very observable, this is exactly what you did. And then give them the impact, because just the behavior by itself, again, it doesn't have the full, it doesn't have the full weight. It's not giving them the full context. So you've got to include the impact as well. Here's what happens when you do this, and here's why this is a challenge or this is a problem. And so really getting clear on that helps then the other person. Ultimately, it's going to be up to the employee or the other person. I mean, you can use this in a peer-to-peer relationship. You can use this with a boss. This formula works for pretty much any conversation you need to have. But it gives then the other person, it's up to them what they decide to do with that. But now at least you've given them the full picture of what they're doing and why that's important.
Mm. It's interesting, Rebecca, how at one point you weren't sure if HR was, where you should be. You went into operations and it was not successful for you. You had a boss that you didn't
Right.
respect, and and you came back. It's so evident to me now, many years later, that this is where you belong. You're good at it. You love it, but you needed that kind of experience to kind of help you make this decision.
I did. Yeah. Well, that was one of the times I was labeled a problem performer. The first time
Mm.
I was labeled a problem performer. And so I went to a different role. I went into operations with the idea that if this was a potential other career path, I was at kind of a crossroads. It was a potential alternate career path that maybe I would love it. There were parts of the job I was really attracted to. And if I didn't, um, I wouldn't ever regret the time that I spent in this role. So I got into it, and again, I did. I loved the parts that I thought I would. I had a large team. I really loved building the team. I actually was in an operations role that was like very physically demanding.
Mm.
I learned to load trailers with high heels, and
Whoa.
it was amazing. I loved working with the team. So all of those aspects of the job were fantastic, but it took a while. It was a very different job than anything I'd done before, and it took a while for me to really come up to speed. And in a role like that, your success is measured not even just on a weekly basis, not even daily. It's measured on an hourly basis. How are
Mm.
we doing from 1 hour to the next? And that was a huge mindset shift for me. So, very long story short, it took me a very long time to really understand, to really get the performance of the team to where it needed to be. And that was the ultimate measurement of success for that job. And, now looking back, I am very grateful for having had that job. All of the pain and the parts that were the most painful are the ones that taught me the most. That's where growth happens, right? Is when we're being challenged the most. And in those moments that feel the most painful, we're definitely learning something.
Mm.
And so now that's how I view that role for sure. But at the time, it really got to the point where I don't know if I was officially labeled a problem performer, but having come from HR, I saw the writing on the wall. I
Mm.
knew where it was headed. My review score had dropped dramatically. The conversations that my boss was having with me, like I saw all the signs. So I knew pretty reliably where it was all headed. And again, I ended up being recruited back to an HR role. Ended up working for the best boss I've ever had.
Mm.
And so again, looking back, that was one of those times and one of those situations where I learned, I had been the high performer, high potential. I was called the corporate athlete.
Mm.
Somebody who could go from any job, right? We can put this person in any job, and eventually they'll get there. They'll figure it out. And so it really messed with my own identity for a while as well, my own self identity. Oh, am I no longer this high potential person? Well, no. What I realized again was the conditions had changed on me, and I needed to change the conditions. That was a part that was in my control. And for me, that was moving again back to an HR role that really felt more like home for me.
Mm. So, Rebecca, I started my company back in the 90s. I wasn't paying attention to myself, and I ended up gaining a lot of weight, working too many hours. My daughter was born. I got myself up to 340 pounds, just completely neglect. And the doctor said to me, if I, don't lose the weight, I'm not going to see your daughter graduate. So I spent the next year and a half losing about 130 pounds.
Wow.
And people ask me, like, they want a kind of short answer, what'd you do? What's your secret? And of course, my secret is just discipline. I got focused. I used discipline. That's how I lost it. How does discipline play a role in your life with everything you've gone through, with cancer surviving, with COVID, with through these shifts in your career? How does discipline play a role in your life, Rebecca Weaver?
It's such a great question. I at times have had kind of an adversarial relationship with the word discipline.
Mm,
um, what I would say, and I think especially more recently, I think that discipline looks different
mm,
than, and maybe that's from person to person. Um, that I have found, especially becoming a business owner myself, it again sometimes is that really painful experience where you learn a lot. It's definitely been that for me in a lot of ways. It has stretched me in ways that I never expected, and also, I think what I have learned, especially the past few years since the cancer diagnosis and through living through all of that, is finding and really radically accepting the way that I do things.
mm,
So when I say adversarial relationship with discipline, what I mean is, I was an athlete growing up as a kid and through high school. And to me, in some ways, discipline was always that you always show up no matter
mm,
what and, push through the pain. Um, and so it was somewhat of a negative connotation for me for a while. Now, to me, what discipline means is deciding to show up for myself. And it looks really different. I think it's a different kind of discipline.
mhm,
For me, discipline looks like setting boundaries and holding to those.
mm,
And so, just on a very practical level, for example, um, setting my calendar. As I mentioned, I have a book coming. My deadline is coming. So I have the next 2 weeks completely blocked off on my calendar.
wow.
And I set that a long time ago, knowing that this deadline would be coming and I would need that time. And so I don't schedule meetings on Fridays because it's a great time for me to either think about or work on my book right now, or other times it's just more open space. And I have learned that I need open space in my day
Hmm.
for full creativity. So for me, I think it just, again, but that's a different type of discipline, I think.
Yeah, boundaries and schedule. Yeah, as I talk to more and more people and I ask this question, Rebecca, I find that discipline is like a spectrum,
Mhm.
and it has so many kind of, facets to it. Um, Most workplace policies read like the instructions on a shampoo bottle. Apply to hair, lather with water, and rinse. Thank you, Captain Obvious.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it's true. It's really my philosophy to, how are we putting practices in place within an organization? And I now very much defer to and prefer to recommend guidelines. Here are the guidelines that we have. And they're famously, I think it was Netflix. I don't know if this is still the case, but for a long time, Netflix had their corporate spending policy was spend it like it's yours, do your
Mm,
best. That was it. And I I will tell you, I've seen the kind of the flip side of policies that are that unstructured. It's not always a good thing. But generally, what I recommend to organizations and to leaders in the same way when you're thinking about coaching your teams, it's really about providing guidelines, helping to explain your thought process. Hey, here are the things that are important. Here's the goal, and this is where we're headed. These are the things that are important to me all along the way. And then now you come up with how we're going to get there, or
mm,
how we're going to fulfill this particular request from a client or project or what have you. With policies, it's here are the guidelines. These are the things that are important to us, and here are the things that we want you to consider when you're making these decisions. Help people make good decisions. That's ultimately your job as a leader, is to help people make good decisions.
mm.
And so we don't need the shampoo bottle stuff, which is, don't go, I don't know. The only one that comes to mind is like, don't watch porn on your
Mm,
company computer, right? Like, we shouldn't have to say that.
right.
And if you do have to say that in your company policies, like, maybe let's look at the people that you're hiring rather
Mm,
than feeling the need to write that into your policies. Sorry, that was the only example that came to
sure.
mind. But that to me is a, should we have to say this? Like, do we
Right.
have to put instructions on a shampoo bottle? Do people not just understand how that is supposed to go? So
Mm.
yes, that's the idea. Guidelines, not rigid policy.
Do not set the office on fire.
Exactly. Yes. There you go. I
Yes.
mean, it's one of those things where it's like, well, I would not disagree that
Right.
that is something you should not do, right?
Mm.
I
Yes.
agree. You should not set the office on fire.
Right.
However, do we have to say it? And I think that's where you see, people come to me, organizations will come to us with manuals, employee manuals that are hundreds of pages long. And I'm like, why
Uh,
do we need hundreds of pages to tell people how to
yeah.
do their job? We trust them to get up in the morning and get dressed, come to the office if that's what we're doing. We trust them to show up. Somehow they're able to make it to the grocery store and make sure that their refrigerator is stocked and they pay their bills on a regular basis, right? Like, we trust people to do all of these things on their own. Why do we feel like all of a sudden when they get into the workplace, we must give them absolutely every single guideline so that nobody will step out of bounds? Like, that, it's just ridiculous to me.
Yeah, it reeks a little bit of kind of lawyers a little bit, and no offense to them, but, just acts detrimental to one another should
Right.
cover that.
Right.
You
Exactly.
know? You
Exactly. Well,
know?
and again, what's the thought process,
Yeah.
And that's where, again, like, we work with organizations to develop their values. Like, that's really what the values are for. That's why I feel
Mm,
like they're so important. Your organization's values are really what help people guide their decisions. What do you want people to take into account when they're making decisions on behalf of your organization? That's it. That is what they're for. And so if you start with the values and feel good about those being articulated, then great. Then the policy part becomes much easier, right? Um, and here's why having a harassment policy in place is super important, because some things do need to be said. We do need to say, this is not acceptable. These are our values in action. Here's what we'll do. Most importantly, probably, right? Here's what we will do if somebody is acting outside of this. Here's how we will deal with that. And then actually following through on that. But again, it's that guidelines and the decision making, rather than being able to anticipate every possible contingency and trying to catch people right before we get there.
mm. Rebecca Weaver, what motivates you?
That's an excellent question for me, especially now. It's a question I've thought a lot about, especially since my diagnosis. Having been diagnosed with cancer at the age of 40, which is considered very young. I didn't feel young until then.
Mm,
um, it's interesting. When you have an experience like that, and again, the pandemic for many of us was that as well, right? This life altering experience, this very aggressive reminder that tomorrow is not ever promised.
mm,
I view it now. The way that I see it is, okay, so now what?
mm,
Okay. So then there's a whole process that I had to go through, a reckoning, really, if you will, for me to even accept getting to that place, right? Because we want to fight it. I want to fight to get back the old way of my old life. And that doesn't exist anymore. It's gone. And that's not what I would choose. But to even get to the point where I accepted that place, okay, so now what? My life, the work that I do, where I spend my time, I want it to have meaning. It has to have meaning. Um, how I'm spending my time must have meaning, both in a professional and a personal sense. I will never ever regret spending time with my kids when they're
Mm.
the age that they are. I will regret things that take me away from that. Um, the work, my professional work must be in service of others. I must stand for something that's important. I have to speak up when I see an injustice. I have to play a role. I have to do my part to understand how to do that. How can I use my platform? How can I use my privilege, the position that I'm in for good? So it's all of those things are the ultimate motivator, but for me, the ultimate motivator is that I know now in a way that I didn't before
Mm.
that I don't know how much time I have.
Hmm.
So that's my ultimate motivator.
Yeah, nobody does.
Mm-mm. Yeah, but I think up until the experience of cancer during the pandemic, because for me, I cannot separate the two.
Right.
Um, Up until that, it was a thought experiment.
Hmm.
And now it's something that I feel like I know deep in my bones. And that's kind of an uncomfortable conversation for people sometimes. I've gotten to a level of comfort with that. Not that I want to have as much time as possible. I hope that it is 60 years. My oncologist kept talking about, well, 60 years from now, you're going to live another 60 years. I'm like, what? I didn't understand it at the time. I hope it's that and more. But at the same time, I also understand that it may not be. And so I have a much, much deeper appreciation for where I am right now. And that this is truly all that we have. And that's the ultimate gift, is that this is what we have is right here and right now. So I want to make it count.
And it's almost unfortunate that we have to have something like that to make us realize that. My sister, 10 years ago, passed away in an auto accident, and so
Mhm.
family comes together, and
Yeah.
we always say I love you before we part ways, and we just change the way we do things because an event like that makes us realize that. And we hopefully whoever's listening, maybe uh, listening to your story, can do that and make that change without something kind of cataclysmic happening to them.
Yeah. I hope so. I really do. I hope that maybe that is your catalytic
Mm,
opportunity, is hearing someone else's story and
right.
not waiting, for the trauma to come to your front door before making those kinds of changes. The reality, I think, for so many of us is that we fall back to, we're just such creatures of habits as humans.
Mm, mm,
And that's why I worry as we're coming out of the pandemic now. There were things that we identified all along that we said, I'm not going back to commuting. Like, I'll tell you, me personally, you can never get me to commute anywhere again on a
right.
regular basis, right? Um, there were all kinds of things that we identified that we wanted to do differently. And we saw hundreds of thousands of people change their jobs or
Yep.
left their jobs. Um, we saw all kinds of changes, but I start to hear these kind of they're just indicators that we're kind of trying to slip back to that old way of doing things. Companies are calling people back to in-person work again. And it feels like a knee-jerk reaction rather than a planned, other than just, oh, we have hundreds of millions of dollars tied up in real estate,
Right.
right? We need to be intentional about the time that we're spending with each other. We need to be intentional about the time we're requiring of each other. We need to be intentional about how we measure success now. We need to be intentional about the things that we recognize and we reward. Like, are we recognizing and rewarding rest in the same way that we are productivity? I don't think we are anymore. And so those are the things that, yeah, how do we make sure that we're holding on to those things and that we really truly are putting them into place? It does not require another global pandemic and global event like we saw for us to really make meaningful change.
I like to typically ask how you measure success, but you kind of asked yourself that before, and by going to your children's functions, and it's a valuable question that we need to ask ourselves, and certainly in HR.
Mm-hmm. We most definitely need to ask the question in our teams. So anywhere we have a gathering of teams, people in the workplace, whatever the workplace looks like. Yeah, I ask for leaders to think about that question. How are we measuring success? And look at both the written and unwritten ways that we measure success. Because the unwritten ones are the ones that actually take root even more. So, as an example, we say, is your organization one that says, oh, we value taking your time off? Yeah, absolutely. We have generous vacation time, et cetera, et cetera. But do you as a leader model that behavior? Do you make sure when you take time off to take your kid to the doctor's office or to go to a soccer game or whatever it is, do you tell people that's what you're doing, or do you block that off and just sort of slink out of the office? When you're doing that, people are paying attention. And so I tell leaders what I want them to think about is be loud about setting that example for your team. If you say, I highly value your time off, I want you to take your time off, and yet you never schedule vacation, the unwritten rule of your team is you're not allowed to take vacation. Or if you do, you will be frowned upon. Because if the leader's not doing it, I sure as heck am not going to be doing that, right? And so those are the things that I really want, again, as leaders ask that question about how we measure success, is do you have an unwritten rule that we measure success by being a work martyr? I'm the one who's always here. I'm going to be the latest to leave,
First
right?
one
Are we
in, last one out. Yeah.
wearing it as a badge of honor, right? Or is that what's happening? And so I really want people to have a really, really deep introspective look at those measurements of success.
Yeah, the workplace martyr is a syndrome, isn't it? It's fascinating.
It sure is. It sure is.
Well, Rebecca, I really appreciate your time. I run a small business. I want businesses to exceed. I want them to excel. And, what you're doing helps them. We have to look at HR seriously. They're not the enemy. They're on both sides. After all, if the company and the employee wins, doesn't everybody win?
We sure hope
Thanks so much for your time. Yeah. How can we get in touch with you? Anyone who's listening?
Oh, yes. So our website is hruprise.com, HRUPRISE.com. So you can definitely find us there. We are on Instagram and LinkedIn, and you can find me, Rebecca Weaver, at LinkedIn as well. I hang out there pretty frequently. So love to.
And it really started with Instagram.
So. Instagram. Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not sure we didn't even get into that story. Yeah. I started HR Uprise as an Instagram account in the wake of Me Too. So we are definitely still there posting on a regular basis. You can find us there in addition to LinkedIn.
And it's great, great content. Rebecca, thank you so much
Yeah.
for your time, and good luck with your book. If I'm ever in your neighborhood, perhaps your husband and I, we can get a cup of coffee.
Would love that. Thanks so much for having me.
You be well.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you for listening and or viewing Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations. Please share this episode with one or two of your friends who you think may benefit from the episode. Our website, www.joeypins.com. There you'll find lots of resources and you could join our mailing list. Please follow us on all our social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Podcast information, the video version of our podcast is on YouTube. Please subscribe. Audio is on all major podcasting platforms. Please follow them. And if you like it, please consider giving 5-star rating. Would really appreciate that. Would you like to financially support the podcast? You can go to our Patreon site. Consider $5, $10, or $20 a month. There's all kind of plans that we have there. There's like a one-time payment. What is this podcast episode worth to you? $25, $50, $100, $500, $1,000, $5,000. You be the judge. You can go to our PayPal account to do that as well. Thank you again for listening or watching Joey Pinz Discipline Conversations.